Welcome everyone. Tervetuloa kaikille, and welcome to our online audience as well in another Nodus Talks edition. My name is Idil Gazulsoy. For those who may not know me, I'm a professor of sustainable design in Aalto University and leading our sustainable design research with Nodus. And we have been running these talks for almost 9 years. They're fairly regular. I see familiar faces, but I also see new faces. So if you follow us up on social media, you can also be informed about upcoming talks. So we do hold these talks 4 times a year, and I'm just going to move this so that we don't have it in the middle of everything. So we run these talks 4 times a year, and every time we bring together one researcher and one practitioner on the same theme. And sometimes our practitioners are also researcher practitioners, like today. So it's of course, if you're doing sustainability work, you're also potentially, doing practice as well. But our logic is to build a bridge between research and practice. And today, I'm really happy to have 2 wonderful speakers, Janne Hukkinen and Sarah Lindemann. So each of them will have 20 minutes of time to deliver their talks. We don't take questions in between presentations because we're interested in the interaction and dialogue. So after both present their presentations, we're going to do a panel discussion. So I'm going to be moderating, and also we are going to be expecting eagerly questions from our online audience as well. And if you cannot hear this slide at any time, please write in the chat. One of us will be screening. So just to quickly, very briefly introduce our speakers. Janne is a professor of environmental policy at University of Helsinki. And I met him years ago when I was actually just arriving to Finland and starting my role. And we briefly talked about this project idea that Janne had. And so today he's going to present the fruits of that project. Policy Operations Room. I'm really looking forward to it. And Sarah, I have known Sarah for quite a while because, as I said, she's also a researcher, but she's wearing a practice hat today here from Aalto. So a very good dear colleague of mine, and she's a founder of the Think and Do tank Leapfrog. She's co-organizing Waste Festival, and she's doing all sorts of really nice stuff in the world. So Janne, without further ado, people are here to listen to you two and not me. I'm just gonna switch the screens and share your presentation with the hope that everything is going to be smooth. Here we are. Not that. And there we go. Everything looks good. I'm also going to get rid of this. So stage is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. And thanks for the invitation. I'll be talking about a project, actually 2 projects, the fruits of 2 projects that ran more or less parallel to each other. One was WISE, another one was Long Risk. And both ended at the end of last year, 23, and focused on basically this, what's in the title. We designed a policy operations room and sort of an initial concept and piloted it. It's a decision platform for anticipating future sustainability crises while coping with the current one. And here are the partners, the lowest texted. There was University of Helsinki, University of Tampere, Aalto University, Turku, Finnish Meteorological Institute, Bias Research Unit. So quite a large set of institutions. Which way to go? No, is it page down or?
Another Mac first go.
No, no.
Yes. You just use the, well,
Okay.
maybe then this.
Just
in the middle.
in the middle. Okay, thanks. So let's start. What motivated us in the beginning, in 2018? The Thunberg question. Greta Thunberg goes around the world asking world's top political leaders, you say you hear us and that you understand the urgency, but if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil. How dare you? And I've presented this conversation never took place, but you could put the former EU leader, Jean-Claude Juncker. We all know what to do. We just don't know how to get re-elected after we're done. In a way, this is exactly what's going on, but it's an interesting puzzle. And I think Jean-Claude Juncker is correct in pointing very honestly the sort of so-called defensive heuristics that have been also found to exist in research. But I think the challenge is actually more complicated than the policymakers knowing what to do. Let's see. In the middle. Okay. Objectives. Here are the objectives. Well, first of all, we want to identify through interviews some of the resilience gaps that exist in the Finnish society. Resilience gaps referring to sort of gaps in preparedness, environmental crisis preparedness. Secondly, a very concrete objective was to design a platform for making long-term decisions while coping with the ongoing ones. In other words, this is the novelty in a sense in the question, and also the novelty in Greta Thunberg's question. Instead of separating the short-term crisis decisions from the long-term strategic decisions, you should be able to combine the two. We live in an era of crisis, and we should be able to manage crisis while thinking strategically. There's some, I'm not going to go through all this, but there's some what I think kind of interesting theoretical twists. People talk about polycrisis, multiple crises happening at the same time. I think the difference in our case is that we're talking about chronic polycrisis. This is a new era. This will keep going on in the future. This relates to sustainability transitions, but this is not really transitions research. It's saying that these disruptions will trigger many of the transitions should they ever happen. Crisis management, but we're talking about the long term, as I said. And we're not really interested in calculating risks. We're more interested in ways of knowing about the unknown. Can you even do that? Data methods. We did a design. One way of separating different kinds of experiments is design experiments versus controlled experiments. Controlled experiments are where you can collect lots of data, do statistical analyses, find out correlations and causalities. Design experiments have sort of a vague idea of what you want to achieve, and then you start reading, theorizing, and doing empirical experiments, and you flip-flop between the two so that they hopefully converge on a design. And this is actually what we did over 6 years. So in the beginning, we did these interviews. We had a loose theorized concept of a policy operations room. In the second stage, we did some experiments. arrive at some preliminary principles for design principles for policy operations room. In the last stage, really experimented in 3 Finnish cities, ran a total of 6 policy operations room simulation exercises in these cities, and ended up with sort of final decision design principles that I'll get into at the end. But first on the interviews, which basically found out about those resilience gaps. So this maybe on the left-hand side, you can see mode 1 and mode 2 preparedness, which are kind of the existing ones. We have mode 1 preparedness, what we call mode 1 preparedness, operational action and readiness. So the threats are then sort of routine disruptions, and I'm reading through the red ones here, red text. And then the how we know about this and prepare for it is that we rehearse in preparedness exercises. In mode 2, that's about prevention and planning. That also we do today. We try to foresee to the future, and we try to plan in reaction to the foreseeable. But the third one, mode 3, building resilience and exploring the unknown, that's the weak spot. So that's where we come into play. It's the threats are really potential disasters, very difficult to anticipate. You don't really know what might happen. Pandemic being a prime example, I think. And you can't really do quantitative risk analysis because you don't really know the consequences. And so it's really the game. The more or less the only game in town is imagination. And that's actually one of the key words of the policy operations room is, how to imagine. This is an initial, idea we had, conceptualization of the policy operations room, what it might look like, and this is actually how the experiments more or less were run in the end. There's a round table. It contains political decision makers. In our case, the top politicians and mayors of the 3 cities, plus their administrators, chief administrators from different sectors. So they were deliberating around the round table. We were observing their deliberations and facilitating, the deliberations. Then there was a dashboard, and this is actually what I'll be sort of illustrating with, an audio-visual dashboard that tried to make the future present and alive for these people in the 2 to 3 hour exercise. I mentioned the stages. In the first stage, we ran one exercise in Helsinki, and this was a scenario there, and then we ran another one, an improved one, we think an improved one based on the experiences we got from the first exercise. In the 2019 Helsinki exercise, we tried to be very true to the complex public crisis, very complicated. We told them this is year 22, recent climate-induced disruptions demand the city's immediate actions on future energy and transportation systems in Helsinki. And then we took them 1 decade at a time until the year 2040. And at each decadal cut point, we presented a situational picture in audiovisual form and offered them 3 alternatives, and they had to choose between those, and then took them 10 years ahead and presented the next situational picture contingent upon what the decision had been, and again took another. So that was, but it was very complex, all kinds of crises happening, and I'll tell you in the next slide what happened. The last 6 forts were different. We just took them to the year 2025. The city has, over the past years, experienced various climate-induced crises, including snow and ice storms, floods, long-term heat waves, rains. Similar events are expected to happen in the future. So we just said that, think of this as the new normal. This will keep going on in the future. And we added realism to it by having the FMI, Finnish Meteorological Institute, import the data of an actual storm in Copenhagen 2011 on top of these three cities and simulate what happens in the downtown areas. And that's what I'll show you briefly. After what did we observe? After the first dashboard, and our interpretation is that it was too complex, the true depiction of a polyprice, too complex to handle. They said, first of all, the participants, the politicians and the administrators, first of all, our strategic plans are fine. And they're fine as long as the economy is in okay. Whatever, as long as the economy is in good shape, we're in good shape. Secondly, the risks you presented are exaggerated, not really true. We don't believe it. So in the second phase, we engaged with cognitive science, basically, the basic notion of cognitive dissonance. We thought that, well, we need to erode their trust in their own plans, and we need to highlight the risks, sort of amplify the risks. And we call this cognitive affective amplification. And the dashboard was a key point there. So in a sense, this is what we did in the second stage. We first of all showed an accident, this Copenhagen storm, then through multiple pathways, showed them that these might be the threats to your strategic goals. And we actually highlighted, this is directly from the dashboard, sort of the beginning, that this is the Helsinki case. We analyzed in detail 8 of their strategic plans and identified the ways in which the Copenhagen 2011 storm imported on top of Helsinki might contradict their strategic plans. I have 2 arrows there in the picture, and they showed it's one example of a strategic threat. The city strategy 21-23-25 states that sustainable growth for the entire city means that we do not increase taxes, we do not borrow more money. The flood protection strategy for the Helsinki region 22-27 states that whatever it takes, we will protect the civilian population against the worst possible flood. And we said that these 2 goals contradict each other. You cannot, with little money, with no tax increases, protect the population against the worst possible flood. And then we showed in the middle of this, you can see the chronic climate crisis, and this is what we did. And this will be a minute-long show, excerpts from the actual audiovisual dashboard. There's a little bit of Finnish there, but they're just excerpts. The first one is a mock-up climate news broadcast. The second excerpt is a mock-up storm weather report of the actual storm, including an animation of how the water level rises in downtown Helsinki. And the third one is a drone view 3D animation of what it looks like when that water is up in downtown Helsinki. So let's see. So this is the mock-up news.
Hyvää iltaa. Viimeaikaiset sääolosuhteet ovat varmasti herättäneet huomiota ja aiheuttaneet.
And it went on. This is the weather report. There's a storm in southern storm front approaching, and it hits Helsinki in the evening. And then this is what it looks like. This is the central railway station.
Nähdään sadekertymä keskustan osissa. Mitä punaisemmat värit, sitä enemmän vettä kadulla on. Hulevesipulvia, kaupunkiveden peitossa, kellareita, alikulkija tulvia.
And then the drone animation. So we're approaching the railway station. That's the railway station. Turn left to the Art Museum Athenaeum. One of the comments we got from one of the high-level administrators of the city of Helsinki that was that great animation, but the color of the water is wrong. We have mixed sewerage. It should be brown. And if this goes on for a week, we'll have cholera in our hands. So this had an impact, at least in these two. It's an example of the strategic threat that I mentioned, the tension between the the financial situation, taking no loan, not raising taxes, versus doing whatever it takes to protect against floods. We offered them alternative solutions, very different. One was separate sewerage, expensive digging underground. The other one was sort of increasing the infiltration surfaces in the city, more distributed, temporary underwater storage. What they ended up with was actually quite interesting. They ended up in a hybrid solution in this case. Well, we'll do some of the stormwater management, but it takes so long, and so we have to do it in stages. But it also takes long to build a separate sewerage. We'll build some of it, so it's kind of a mix. And most importantly, the last point, they said that we need a strategic plan on stormwater management with financial commitments extending beyond the 4-year electoral cycle, which is kind of interesting that we're going to tie the hands of the future politicians, elected politicians. More generally, these are some of the design principles. First of all, I think in terms of participants, it's important to bring together decision makers, politicians and experts around the same round table. So it's kind of a simple thing, but this rarely happens, at least in many of the Finnish cities. They do not have these guys. They listen to experts and then they kick them out and then they start decision making. And that's not how you would do it in our case. We need to promote equal authority between the experts and the politicians. This is very sensitive. We saw it already in the pandemic that politicians, at least in Helsinki, felt that they were being ripped off by the experts of their political power, decision-making power. In terms of the agenda, we need both, some kind of system, such as what the policy operations tries to do, to facilitate the creation of alternative futures, facilitate the framing of decision problems in different alternative ways. All of this is about imagining what could happen. And this is really the point of the core exercise, not practice against, not test whether or not the systems of the city are prepared against a particular kind of crisis, but rather practice whether or not they can imagine, different kinds of unexpected futures and do something about it. Because so it's a simple thing, but it's quite different from the existing preparedness exercise. And finally, discourage defensive heuristics, what Jean-Claude Juncker was saying in the beginning. Really challenging the strategies the way we did, challenging their positions, that if you're a politician, you have to accept that they're also experts in these particular cases that can, contribute valuably. And also challenge the venue. This is actually something we learned, that it's not a very good idea to take them to the boardroom where they always sit, but take them to a different physical location for the policy operations room. Kind of like the White House just renewed their strategic, where they go somewhere underground to think about what to do with the terrorists or whatever. So they have it's a separate space for doing critical stuff. I'm not going to talk about that. Some concluding remarks. I think the future is, in an environmental sense, we should prepare ourselves for chronic environmental crisis. We have entered an era where we will be flip-flopping between the normal and the crisis. And it's interesting to see that we're clear the decision makers today are not prepared for that. I mean, they sort of, if you listen to politicians carefully, they always preface what they say, that now that the pandemic is over, we can, do the normal stuff. And I think that's a mistake. we should have multifunctional physical and service infrastructures, by which I mean, in a physical infrastructure, I think if I were deciding on the city of Helsinki's underground, I don't know, garage spaces and whatever underground spaces, they will be flooded in the near future. So the question is, would you like to maybe flood protect them and use them as temporary water storage, and kick the cars out from the parking spaces because usually we can predict the floods, and then pump it out gradually after the flood, and that's it. Or during the pandemic, we saw that hospitals quite flexibly could, after a while, establish temporary multifunctional space, temporary hospital spaces. Second point, I also mentioned that we need an ability to imagine future challenges, and we need to practice that imagination. And this is exactly the point of the policy apparatus. We need to have this as a repeating normal practice, in addition to the quite normal crisis preparedness exercises, where you sort of test whether or not your organization function in particular crisis. I think the barrier of implementation to a policy operations room, we didn't do any institutional changes. We just asked administrators and politicians to find a time in their calendars to come together and play for 2 or 3 hours. I think the principles that I just showed, the design principles are quite generic, and I think they should be tested then in various situations, in other contexts, in other administrations, other levels of decision making. I think that's it. Thank you.
So the stage is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Janne, for your really interesting presentation, and thanks, Sibyl and Sato, for the invitation. So my name is Sara, and I'm representing Leapfrog. Yes. So Leapfrog is a think and do tank, and we're working on innovation in a time between worlds. Very briefly, we do different forms of education. We do narratives and strategy for organizations to be more aligned with polycrisis and with complexity aligned practices. We do action research, and we work with societal tech. And as Idul mentioned, I have a background from Aalto University, where I've been working with transdisciplinary sustainability innovations. What are the processes for multi-stakeholder collaborations in areas of water, energy, housing, so forth. But Leapfrog does slightly different things. So I've had some realizations that I will share, and I will talk a bit about why we need to change how we innovate now that we are in a time between worlds. So even though I'm representing the practitioner here, I will have to go a bit into the thinking, because without that, it's a bit difficult to talk about the cases. And I was thinking of sharing about one particular project that we're working on. So if you bear with me, I will go through the background, because this rests on quite a lot of our philosophy. So if we think of the world that our children steps into at the moment, they might sort of first become familiar with some problematic issues like the climate, like the war in Ukraine, and so forth. But as their understanding of the world develops and they grow older, unfortunately, the picture starts to look like this. And so what we're seeing here is evidently the polycrisis. We have multiple crises that are interconnected. They have cascading effects between them. and we cannot solve them in isolation. The challenge is that our way of addressing problems, our way of solving problems historically has been that we divide issues into as narrow as possible units, and then we design a solution to that. And this is currently how we are trying to address the polycrisis. We're trying to look at climate separate from mental health, separate from social isolation and so forth. We can look at the SDGs, how they're designed into 17 boxes with sub-targets, and we have the idea that if we deal with the different parts and they are sort of fixed, we put them all together, it will work. But that would work for a car. That doesn't work for a complex system, needless to say, for a complex civilization with multiple, for everything from ecology to social systems. So we have a problem with responding to the polycrisis. And if we, in this picture, we can see that the previous one, the polycrisis, the cascading effects, all of that is the explicit. That is the explicit things that we see. But what is beneath all of that? Why do we have a situation where our ways of organizing are causing polycrisis, and they are not just, they are accelerating. In many ways, these situations are accelerating. Nobody wants this, yet it is happening and it's accelerating. So this is, there's a discussion between poly and meta crisis. So this is thinking on the meta crisis that encourages us to also look at what is in the implicit, what are the underlying dynamics that are upholding and accelerating the polycrisis. And here, this is not an exhaustive list, this is some examples. There are, for example, perverse incentive structures, rivalrous dynamics, arms races, double binds, like which Janne also was talking about, that politicians are often in a double bind situation. Will they respond, do what they should do, but then if they do that, they lose power. So, and then somebody else comes in that maybe does something worse. So we are in a situation where nobody is fully in control of the situation, and we are also, for example, destroying substrates. We are trying to address the already over complex with more with complicated to taking over the complex. Like we would have a rainforest where we're substituting it with a monocrop farming. That all of these things increase the stability of the whole. So what can we do about it? Well, there are things we can do about it. We can try to understand this. And when we look at this, now we're zooming out, and I think we need to zoom out because we've been zooming in too much and going into disciplines and sectors and so forth. Now we need to zoom out. If we look at the whole picture, there are three main sort of attractors where this could go. One is chaos, one is dystopia, and could there be something else? The dystopia is a solution where we're trying to centralize, in a centralized way, address all of these, which may lead to a sort of technology empowered, very highly centralized situation with very limited personal freedoms, which for many of us rings as a dystopia. The other attractor is a chaos situation, where we have, in response to all of these crisis situations, we have uprising and really reduced capacity for collective sense-making and decision-making, and a sort of collapse. So the question is, how do we start building a third attractor? And a good starting point perhaps is to look at, okay, and now I'm going into where innovation as a practice. So now, if you look at any society, this is an anthropologist based on Marvin Harris. You can see 3 layers. This is, similar for a sort of indigenous community or a large community. And this this visual helps to see that change in one of the layers influences aspects in the other layers, and they interconnect. And historically, what we've seen is that technology quite effectively influences the others. And often when we come from humanities, we want to think that ideas and values are primary and that technology follows. But if we look at history, for example, now just social media, 10 years, and social media is really influencing our political system. It's influencing our psychologies, our information landscape, and that took only 10 years. And for sort of printing press and so forth, that influenced society significantly. That took hundreds of years. The plow took thousands of years. Now we have generative language models. It's probably not going to take 10 years for them to significantly influence our social agreements, the social agreements, governance structures, market structures, and culture. And now this is happening unconsciously. And that is a big problem. So when we are innovating in a time of polycrisis, the innovation needs to focus on all of these societal levels so that we are able to more consciously design or make an effort to see what are the unexpected or the externalities of technology design. And here are, for example, some of this is just, examples of what are because we cannot foresee this, but we can put some design criteria. So, for example, on the technology level or the infrastructural level, okay, we need closed material loops within the available energy. On the societal agreements, we need to identify and remove perverse incentives. We all know that it is perverse that medical companies benefit from illness. We cannot have those kinds of structures. On the cultural levels, how can we have identity and value foundation where we want to align the well-being of all agents in the commons? We don't have that at the moment. So this is something, okay. It is not, even if we have this crisis and all the complexities, we are able to have some fundamental design criteria that we want to guide our activities towards. And when we look at the innovation, because most of the innovation now is when we look at climate tech, health tech, it's going into technology. We are not making an effort to innovate our social agreements and our culture. And that is a problem that needs to be complemented. So when we go into this, one is to see that the technology is designed in consciously so that it's aligned with this. And another aspect is also to look at the decision making behind technology, because that is also currently very undemocratic. So very briefly, I think I will skip this just for the sake of time, but we can see that we have sort of, say, I'm assuming many of you know this is the 3 horizons of, so kind of pushing the agenda towards the 3rd horizon in terms of, for example, systems innovations, how can we, and democratic innovations, they are kind of still not really addressing the underlying structures. They're operating within the current structures. And we need, in order to meet these design criteria, we need to go even further into the core, and we need to sort of, at least what we are working with in Leapfrog is that we have to try to find the structures for us to do that, so that we can start channeling this. Otherwise, as a society, we are kind of lame in our, unable in our response to do this. And maybe still on this, an important thing when we think about innovation in the time between worlds, when we do this societal transformation, we need to innovate, we need to create new, but things also need to die, which is another part of that. So this kind of innovating in this transition is not just to be obsessed with the new, it's to be very cautious about what is it that we really need to develop, and let's focus on that, and also as a part of it, letting things die. And one project that we are working on is crowdsourcing food system futures. And this is a collaboration with Sitra and VTT. And we are still in the midst of this work. So what I can share with you is a bit of the thinking behind the work. And then you'll see how we're trying to do something that aligns with these design criteria and address the problem of innovating on the social agreements. So this project is part of the Citra's Power Over the Future work, and we are collaborating with VTT and their research in food systems. And VTT evidently has power over the Finnish food system, and they are also conscious of this, and they want to share this power over the future. But what we realize when working with them is that the infrastructure for doing so is missing. The methods, the approaches, the tools for doing so they're really not there. That there is a way you can do some workshops, you can include, but there is a risk of that becoming legitimizing existing practices rather than actually shifting the decision making towards new methods. So here we are testing a distributed ethnography method where we can have, so this is kind of like an additional layer to system innovation according to MIT. Well, this is more complexity aligned. So we are collecting narratives through a technology called SenseMaker on food system actors to be able to get a sort of narrative-based landscape of what are the theories of change in the system, and then be able to sort of, an important phase there is to strengthen different theories of change. What are the underlying arguments that they have and so forth. This is infrastructure that doesn't exist. There are some pilots around the world, but it kind of, this is something we could do. This is the kind of new innovation that we could do. This is the new libraries, the new tools that we need to be able to make decisions. And then we could have sort of a complementary similar landscapes of the general population, of what is their life experience, what are their relations to food, for example, so that we could see these kinds of landscapes where the uphill is kind of the energy cost, say, for a consumer to shift food behavior in a certain direction. We can do these kinds of analysis, and the trick here is that it's very, sort of, it's not energy efficient to sort of say to people, don't eat meat, because the energy cost for them in their whole identity and all that to do that shift is very high. So we need kind of a balancing between the experts of the ecosystem, the facts, the energy cost of people changing their behaviors, and then be able to have an analysis where all of this could be solid enough to actually influence decision making on how we, where we put our innovation money, basically, as a society. And this, we have realized when we do this project, this infrastructure doesn't exist. So we have to try to build it now, see what would it take. And ideally, this would, this type of then more complexity aligned practices would need to be ongoing. And this relates to what Janne was saying about sort of the third model of a resilient future, where you could have a future response, where you could have ongoing listening to society to see, okay, this crisis happened. How is the landscape changing? What micro initiatives can we do to respond to this, so that the innovation and the resilience, as we see it in the future, really are intertwined. So it's not about creating. It's not about growth or that kind of thinking. It's a very different logic where the practices we are doing for innovation in sort of when there's not an acute crisis going on, when the crisis hits, could be shifted to help crisis response. So these kind of sort of narrative-based human sensors is one project that we are working with as an example of innovation during the poly crisis. And of course, when we think about all this, it's important to think what can we all do? And that goes to our personal resilience, to thinking very carefully about how we use our professional skills. It's very easy to be kind of comfortable in where we are, and so we have to sort of try to do these kind of important decisions ourselves. As how can we really try to work on the really critical aspects. So we can maybe talk about all of this, but there are a lot of things we can do, like the imagination and so forth. And then to be more cheerful, I also want to invite you all to Waves, and particularly if you're interested in this topic, we also have Daniel Schmachtenberger himself coming in online and discussing with Susanna Pettersson-Atte from Sitra and Ilona Lundström. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion to see how do they think about what's the capacity for us to respond, and what can Finland do, or the Nordics. We are we have a better situation than many others, so how can we use that? So since we are all nerds on these types of topics, here's also a 20% off code for Nodus. Yeah. So I hope you come and bring these discussions to the group. But yes, so that's me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you also, Sarah, for a very interesting, inspiring talk. And also thank you so much for the 20% off. It's I think the first thing we are participating in our 20th, not 20th. Oh, we're not going to be having Nodus talks in 20th time. Hopefully the world will be better by that. But anyway, thanks a lot. So we also I would like to also mention Sarah Waitman being there, because some of our students might know of her, and in Nodus there are some fans of her. So, but thank you. Now I would like to invite you to the front. I'm just going to change the screen to our little. I have to start with to warm up the room, and also please, our online audience, put questions there. We are reading your comments, but it would be fantastic if you formulated questions based on those comments. First of all, I'm really interested in, because you mentioned about design and imagination, and the project is very much, I think, aligned with certain things that I have been doing. So who was a design researcher in your project, and who were you collaborating with in Aalto? With Ahti Salo?
No. Aalto was actually Peter Lund, who was an energy professor. So because we had, I didn't do all of the details, but there was a fairly large component on sort of, power systems and these kind of things.
But did you have design scholarship?
Let me think a while. Not explicit, no, not that I would call design scholarship. No.
And I'm really interested, because we talked before everyone else came, that I asked you the question of, is this similar to the Chilean, 1970s?
Yeah.
And you said that we got the inspiration from.
That's one of the, we discussed
So,
cybersecurity.
Exactly. So those who are familiar with systems theories and thinking will also be familiar with the Chilean distributed governance experiment.
Yes.
So what kind of similarities, or what inspiration did you take from that?
I think it was very sort of initial discussion on the concepts of the policy operations room. I mean, actually, the policy operations room concept, I used it in an article, I think 2012 or something, quite early. So in a sense, that was which had to do, it's fairly true to the original idea that we sort of think about the long term while we try to cope with the ongoing crisis. But the similarities with cybersecurity, I think there is this roundtable idea. I mean, if you look at I was just on Wikipedia and looking at the cybersecurity. There's a long article on cybersecurity and a photograph of it. And I remember it's in some museum I have seen. When I saw the photograph, I knew that I have seen it. It is in some museum. I forget where, but I've seen the actual cybersecurity. They have the primitive computers there, but it's sort of around set up and all of the each participant can sit. It's kind of like any kind of operation. I should also say that what a key inspiration was this combination of a control room combined with sort of strategic policy development. Because control rooms have this, interaction there. It's improvising. You have, Fingrid, the power grid of Finland, the central. They have control, but they have the heterogeneous system, and they have to react to all kinds of crises online.
Okay, well, thank you. And my starting question for you, Sarah, is a bit personal, because you started with, the concept of children, and children is kind of like, gateway to future. And I just wondered, I know that you have children, so I know that I can ask this question. Did you change in relation to your relation to future as a result of having children, in relation to environmental issues, societal issues, and etc.? So could you share that a little bit?
Yeah. Yes, I did. I did have a sort of a bit of a turnaround and a personal shift that I have along background of working with sustainability transitions in emerging markets, and that was in a way I was very passionate about that, and a whole lifestyle of traveling there and working in slums and all of that. And then I had this period of having children and the pandemic, and thinking, sort of developing my thinking, also learning more about the crisis situation, and all of this mixed together. I had several realizations. One is that perhaps it's not mine to be in emerging markets. That even though I sort of, so that was one, like, okay, I was kind of, okay, I'm letting go. Letting go of that. I'm grateful for all the learnings I've had, and I think it's really relevant to sort of understand the resource scarce realities, because we are going to have resource scarce realities here. So I'm sort of grateful for that experience, and I hope it will be useful here also. And then I also had a bit of a sort of realization of that I was thinking about climate, and I was thinking about poverty, and I was, like a bit distant to technology, to other areas that, and sort of, this whole like game theory denying, and all of these different things that I was like, oh, okay, maybe have to sort of try to address it. And that has led to the kind of work that we're doing. Of course, very much in conversation with Thomas, my husband and partner. So it's been a joint process.
Okay, well, I hope I warmed the room up enough. So we have Eva from the in-person audience, and then I'm going to read a couple of questions from our online participant, Timo Hämäläinen. Eva, please.
Yes, thanks very much, and also thank you for the
Sorry, because we don't have microphones today, could you actually project your voice? Because this is the only technology we have for reaching our online audience, yeah.
Thanks very much, both, and I'm trying to make this comment and question something that will link the two things, but something that also bothers me a lot about the whole conversation about innovation. And I think it was, for me, there was a crystallization, Sarah, in the image that you showed from what she said was inspired from Paris, where you have technology, social agreements, and culture. And yet, when both of you were talking about how those things, as you zoom out, they loop back into each other. And I'm really struck so often in these conversations that despite the fact that we know that the economy is not the enemy of the environment, it's so easy to tell stories about the double binds by pointing to the lack of resource, the lack of money, and the lack of economic ways of processing that loop. So I'm wondering whether you agree with my kind of analysis that the three layers are to perhaps kind of point in a kind of deterministic way, which is part of our imagination that we need to get rid of. That we think that technology is somehow more concrete than culture, and we think that social agreements don't have to do with economics, or that culture doesn't have to do with it, or that technology doesn't have to do with it. So there was something about that cake that got me thinking, and I wonder if that's suggestive. And I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to go on Zoom and sit on the bus and listen to it.
I also would like to also hear, this is a good moment, because when you were showing that image, Sarah, we had a comment saying, similar to Marx's productive forces, relations, and superstructure. So, as an analogy, just.
Or as I was thinking that it's basically the same layers as in the current literature on sustainable transitions or socio-technical. You can see the landscape. And
but that is quite problematic for the reasons that it was developed by looking at case studies
But I mean, it's sort of very generic. You can see across various kinds of strands of research the same kind of conceptualization. But can I sort of immediately react to that? Because I absolutely sympathize with your point, and on a cognitive level, we encounter that issue of first trying to present the system, the complexity of the poly crisis as it really is. And the participants in our experiment, they were just confused and sort of resorted to the status quo that everything is okay, well, as long as the economy is okay. And then we had to resort to a simplification. We presented, in fact, not a poly crisis, but a single event that actually happens or introduced here, and then that cascaded a little bit. But in the end, they started redesigning the sewerage system, for example.
Despite
with our vision, and it's. I think there's a dilemma there that if you want to, I don't think you can imagine solving a systemic crisis. I think what you need is that you kick it, and then you're really careful. You don't kick it in the wrong place. That's where you'd like to have some kind of modeling, systemic understanding. You kick it, and then you see what happens. Best we can do. Hope for the best. And it's sort of going to this that you can't grasp everything at the same time. And that's why I'm actually concerned there may be questions, but if Timo Hämäläinen is asking, he's probably asking about systemic thinking. And I think that this is my skeptical.
We don't know which
thinking.
Timo Hämäläinen.
We don't
One
know.
Timo Hämäläinen.
But some-
Just-
but-
I will read their question, but do you have a response to Eeva's question or Eeva's comment?
I have a comment. I'm not sure if I'm sort of responding well with me, but I think we have we have to live with both, that we try to sort of talk about the whole thing and talk about the underlying dynamics, but then in practice, when we go into sort of the reality, then we need to have functional, then maybe more like an applied complexity approach, where, so for example, those would say that, you know, we can't outline the whole thing because everything is contextual and everything is, and that is also true. So I think we need kind of both, and particularly that we actually need those practices. So we have to start getting them in shape, and I hope that the crises that are coming will encourage us to use them, that we will have a situation of that the sense of urgency and the kind of kicks to the systems will come. And then the question is that when they come, are we prepared enough so that we are able to then, and that's why I think it's important now in kind of like a bit sort of steady situation that we try to build up some practices. They might be wrong, they might be right, but at least we're trying.
Okay, so here comes from the online audience, and please, Rue, prepare your questions because it's going to be your turn next. So building collective cognitive diversity is important for improving resilience. Janne emphasized the shared sense-making process. What kinds of information and knowledge gathering strategic intelligence activities should the policy-making groups use? Strategic intelligence activities in quotation marks. Same question for Sarah. Would solving wicked problems ideally require different kinds of information sources besides the micro-narratives?
Yeah, I think, well.
Yeah, I could go, yes. Yes, it needs additional sources than the narratives. So the narratives is like a complementary analysis and a complementary data set, but that needs also sort of the expert knowledge and the decision makers and their interaction. So I think we need kind of all of these things and combine together in new ways. And this is kind of new infrastructure that I think we need to start setting up now that we can.
Yeah, I mean, strategic intelligence is interesting. My sort of simple answer is that we need whatever you can get, and then you should really think carefully about the presentation to sort of the decision makers, those making decisions on strategic issues. But I mean, it's that we experimented with different kinds that we had. Bayesian network analysis, looking at sort of the causal heuristics and analyzing, sort of dissecting or teasing out the most important things with Bayesian analysis. We did some of that. I mean, you can do other. Currently, I have a project when we're doing some more less quantitative analyses of networks and cognitive heuristics. So I mean, there's also, and I think AI opens up all kinds of possibilities, all kinds of, and modeling and things like that.
And maybe to build on that, I think what is really important that we have the AI and opportunity, but how we develop it is so critical, because if it is developed sort of within a context of rival versus dynamics, we might have, it might not be optimized for collective decision making or for caring of the commons and so forth. So it's really critical that we create the possibilities to develop these technologies so that they address these social agreement, sense-making, decision-making processes, cultural processes, so that they are. So I think that's really critical.
Okay, thank you. So please.
So Harshit, I'm a researcher and foresight practitioner. And one of the problems we have with foresight is getting decision makers to actually integrate it into the process of decision making. And this is why I love what you've done, Yanni, and how you get them to think about scenarios in a practical manner. And one of the other challenges I think we have in general is that the images of the future we have that's mostly generated by sci-fi dystopian movies. And I was really impressed by the idea that you made it, you added the audiovisual component into this practice, because it then makes them live the whole process. But I wanted to ask as well, what role do positive scenarios play in such a setup? Because I think it's important to think about what we should be doing, not only to prepare, but to actually improve the future.
Yeah, in principle, I think you could do it that way too. But I suppose it would be, well, not necessarily different. You could have a separate kind of room for that kind of, those kinds of exercises, sort of envisioning positive futures. But actually, now that you raise it, I would actually go to one of the points that I raised in my presentation, which is and I think this is intriguing. In English, we have disruptions and transitions or transformations. And disruptions are often the negative, and the transformation and transitions are the positive ones. In Finnish, there's murros, which is the same for both. And I think this is, well, it's sort of a shortcut, but it's interesting, it's intriguing, because of what I said is that, in the crisis, you can have the seeds of a positive, in the disruption, the seeds of a positive transformation. And I think I'm a pessimist in this sense, looking at what's going on, is that, that we don't really, I've been in this business for 40 years, so talking about sustainability and what we should be doing. We're not really, we're pretty slow in doing it. So we're sort of hitting the wall, and then we're probably doing something. So that's kind of, it probably, the way it will play out, that's my prediction, is that we will be hitting those walls. We will be encountering disruptions that hopefully, if things go well, will trigger positive transformations. And then this leads to your question now, how did we combine? And that would be the next sort of intellectual design exercise.
Please.
Maybe one comment that I think is good to sort of a reflection to bring in is that we have a lot of talk about scenarios. But I think it's good to know that there is a critique to the scenarios also in the sense that when we have a scenario, we lock ourselves into that scenario and we kind of might get stuck. So we think about the storm and then we think that then the storm is the COVID crisis. And that is human, and we have to live with that. We need the scenarios, but in our response, we might be good to put our efforts also sort of in understanding now, being able to operate now, build practices now, build also, like say, if you think of youth, critical to all of this is their capacity not to sort of keep their attention so that their attention is not sort of totally hijacked by an AI or something else, so that they're able to sort of be and make sense and think, and so that we are able to respond to this on multiple levels. So really building that response capacity, whether on an individual level or in organizational levels, like here and now, is really, I think, really important in futures work. That sort of like in being able to respond to the future because it's also unpredictable now.
Can I have a brief comment on that? I think that it's actually continuing on this thing that the futures research and scenario work suffers from the fact that we always have this dystopian scenario, the business as usual, and then the optimistic. And when in fact, the way things go, it's sort of, it's a flip-flop. It goes here and there.
I feel very conflicted as a moderator because I have a lot to kind of say as a person whose research is primarily kind of focusing on positive visions I'm like, oh, do I intervene? And I will, of course. I mean, thank you. Positive visions, I think, are quite important. But in my own research, working solely with positive visions, I did not necessarily see any significant mindset change in policymakers, because policymakers on a day-to-day are bound by the kind of same double bind.
Yeah.
So positive vision, negative vision, we can try all of that. But what is becoming, as a researcher and nerd also in this area, what's becoming interesting for me is this exact kind of, what kind of imagery, positive or negative, but what kind of imagery is actually creating the kind of connection and, future situatedness that is necessary for people to really discuss futures from an informed position. We're trying experiential futures of this and that, but then neuroscience comes and tells us that, well, not everyone can actually do that. So there are also limitations on. But I'm going to now go back to the online audience questions, and please prepare for the next one. So thanks for the great discussion. As the current innovation paradigm is based on growth and techno-economic paradigm, can you find ways of selling this into this paradigm? For example, that the systems innovations we create positive opportunities for Finland and our institutes. Easily we emphasize the risk perspective. So I guess the question is, can there be ways of how I understand this question is maybe a little bit rephrasing it quite radically, but what are the ways of working within the system in a way that, we can transform the system?
This is what we're trying to do in Leapfrog. We're trying to sort of accept the innovation practices towards a more meta-crisis aligned. And so we're searching for those ways of doing it by reaching out and seeing where does it resonate, what are the kind of what are the people in society, the organizations that resonate to this. And I think what we've learned so far is that quite in perhaps surprising places, this does resonate. Like, we've been working a lot with VTT that has very, even though they have, of course, very strong technology, they're very interested in systems innovation and interested in sort of engaging the broader public, which is a really interesting thing, because they are sort of, they're a national institute for technology. So I think that we have, there are these, the commons is there somewhere. And also foundations for youth are really concerned. Bildung foundations are interested in this, from the resilience, risk management, so that's kind of where we come to that, because somehow more fundamental, the reason, I think it's really important in this also to seek perspective and not, it's easy to blame the economy or to blame someone, but the reason why we are emphasizing growth is because growth has been a barrier for our well-being and sort of the welfare of Finland. But if it no longer is that, or if we see that there is so many crises coming in and that that is a threat to our, because the core is still that we want to sort of maintain the well-being and the welfare, all of that, and if that argument starts to be more diverse, more nuanced, then maybe we can have this discussion without going into sort of a blame game. And
I have a very concrete 2 examples. One, an organizational way of turning the negative into a positive, and another, a sort of a technical solution. The organizational is just an experience that we happen to have accidentally in the project. The first contact, my contact in the city of Helsinki, happened to be their emergency preparedness person, who's responsible for the entire city's emergency preparedness. That was the right contact, in contrast to another city where we contacted first the strategic planning. Strategic planning said that, well, look, everything's under control. We're planning. We don't need to talk about it. You don't need to talk to us about the long-term crisis management. Well, the crisis emergency preparedness guys who usually work on immediate crisis preparedness, they said, this is wonderful. We have always been thinking about the longer term, that the city never did. We are only supposed to put out the fires, but we need to think about the long term. So that's an organization, you know, I was selling the crisis and sold it successfully to the right audience. Now, the technical example is precisely this, one of the technical solutions that you can do a lot of flood control, but if, for example, your flood control is increasing the infiltration services in downtown, you're creating green space.
Mhm.
So you're preparing for the worst by beautifying, greening the city. And that's great. That's a good selling point.
Mhm.
But maybe on this that maybe I would switch the word from selling to where does it resonate,
Mhm.
and that goes to the imagination also, because in a way we could also say that youth, because you know a lot of youth are, you know, of course you're supposed to be frustrated when you're in your teens, but now also it's even more so because there could be, you know, an intuition that, for example, the education system is, you know, you're expected to be 15 years in school and then contribute to society when you have an intuition that, you know, there might not be a job for me, or that this is, you know, not relevant or old fashioned. So I think it's, you know, a bit across where are the resonances, because we are very much a collective being, and there is a shared intuition, even if we are so stuck in the education system. There is an increasingly strong intuition about where we want to be and where we want to go on different levels. So I think we just have to sort of keep strengthening that. And
plus, the sociologist Jens Becker has a book on capitalism, Imagined Futures. And the point is that capitalism is all about selling the right kind of imagination.
Well, it's a bit ironic if we use tools of capitalism
It is. It was a joke.
I wanted to, I was thinking about this perverse incentives model, and actually when we think about youth, they are in a way a bit more immune to that, because the moment you grow older, have power in the system, you start to get those conflicts. So how could we unlock that power of youth when we imagine the social experiment beyond this perverse incentives?
yeah, maybe they're also in a way this links to so we have to sort of face the situation and move beyond naive responses, and you know, and when you know, maybe there is the way to guide and have a conversation between youth and, you know, other generations. So because there is, you know, it is very easy to think that okay, we're just going to make an eco village here and you know, but then if you look at the dynamics, then that you know, we have the Tibet syndrome that you might create a utopia, but the utopia is, there's a game theory dynamic, and that utopia is not likely to win in the end. So we have to sort of if the intention is sincere, we have to engage with these power bundles, at least try to engage with them and see how the power can be shifted through some new ways.
I would just like to share an anecdote that relates to the youth and power of youth. So in a project that that we are working, which aims to link raw emission observation data with some magic in between to climate action and policy. So it's a large consortium project, and we have TUM, Technology University of Munich, as a partner. And they have done a lot of research in Munich, and they found that the key reason Munich city has actually put in place these climate-related policies was the youth protests. Yeah, so they kind of identified it as the key driver, which I thought to be really, really interesting. So, indeed.
It's actually one of the comments, interesting comments, one of our exercises came from a politician that, your scenarios and audiovisual things were kind of lame, because you didn't take into account the real political drama that happened, the political pressure, such as a protest outside the city hall. And that was a weakness in our, we're sort of fairly distanced from the politics, the real politics. And that actually, so I really believe this, that if something moves politicians, it is people on the street.
On that note, yes, please.
I started to wonder, as I was wondering about this, how to call them, these kind of conflicting interests that politicians, for example, might have within their work. Can you, as innovators, notice some conflicts that you might have in your work, in your innovation work, some things that kind of they would feel conflicting. For example, if you need to sell or make something that kind of is, how would you say that? Is something you want your customers to buy, or something else, is different conflicts in innovation work?
Yeah, my spontaneous reaction is that it is how I perceive the situation is a bit it would be good to be in an institution, because then there would be more power and more influence. But if you're in an institution, whichever institution, then you get binded. Then there are certain binds of that. But then again, there is and it's a bit now different institutions are wanting to do this, but the institutions per se pull them back. So you have, and then in between the institutions, the actors are powerless. But still, that is that is kind of the most potential area. So it's it's kind of a trade-off between power and freedom, not unboundedness, that has to be sort of collectively well paid somehow. So
I think in response to that question, it also applies to research. Particularly if you've ever been in a Horizon project, an EU project with sort of policy implications, you as a researcher, the more experienced you become with those projects, is that you have a double life. One hand, you have the life you think that you are the project officer, and you provide you divide your work into work packages. You have milestones, you reach the milestones, and then you have deliverables, and you have to provide what you promise in so that's the EU work. But then you frame the whole thing differently, and you can do really interesting things in terms of research. Find new things. You don't have to tell them exactly the way they want, what you actually found out. You have to tell them in terms of the original deliverables. But then you can do whatever you want in the free world, or the other world of research.
Yeah.
It's the same in universities, by the way. It's the same thing, quality control, all of that stuff. It's a different thing from the real lives of academics.
Yes, please. Yeah, we do. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, I need to.
when it comes to like a current crisis situation, it seems like there's so much uncertainty that sometimes there would be actually so much more like adaptation, measures compared to maybe mitigation measures. And there's kind of like this trade-off between short and long term. And so I actually with Falcon Tuesday, they were doing this climate resilience project in New York, and they were very surprised about how like New Yorkers were so approachable and like on the streets, for example, and the neighbors when it comes to the research. And so I was thinking when it comes to maybe the Finnish context, like if there were this like multifunctional spaces, for example, and sort of like political measures, yeah, how do you think like the citizen participation would be in those contexts? Because I guess like it will also maybe change the social and cultural situation when it comes to climate resilience on another. And so, yeah, in practice, okay, evacuate all the parking lots, for example, like how would that happen when it comes to yes,
That's really interesting. It's in many ways, you know, in retrospect, when I think of the project, what we did, we were kind of elitist, and we realized it from the beginning. We dealt with the experts and the decision makers, policymakers, and sort of the citizen participation is really that, in a sense, it was a choice we made, but it's also the weak spot because I think there's increasing. Kind of goes to this citizens' protest. I mean, we need to have somehow engaged citizens. There's interesting work actually in climate adaptation. For example, there's a visiting professor, David Schlossberg, right now in University of Helsinki, who works on how Australian communities adapt to different kinds of climate induced crises. And I think that's really important. That's sort of the game that we will be facing, is that the real innovation that happens in adaptation, for example, it can only take place at the local level, because the formal, whatever emergency or crisis management systems you have, they will always be late, and they will always be deficient. So it really goes to the kind of local level.
The quick comment, but I also when I'm thinking about this, I notice that I think more and more about that. In some form, inevitably, the citizenship will change, so that it's more sort of learning and sort of social action is more intertwined. So now that we have like a completely different model from what we have now, where we have kind of like like in education factory for the industry, so something else where you're much more involved. One thing that's likely to emphasize that, and this is what we're testing with the narratives, that's kind of to understand where are people, you know, what is their life, what is their lived experience, and can they share it, and can that be, because we also have the situation that, you know, we are in this boat, all of us, you know, the bunker in New Zealand strategy is unlikely to work, which means that there will be refugees that are engineers that can do CRISPR in their tent, in their basement.
And Zuckerberg has his island in Hawaii.
Yeah.
With the ranch.
Yeah. So there's kind of like that should encourage us to some kind of citizenship where we need to know how are people, those are everyone. Kind of like, or like not we know, but that everyone needs to somehow own their own data, but it's kind of like that share, that some kind of collectiveness, which leads to this culture of like only, and we probably need some technologies to help us do that, and there's 1,000 questions on how, and so there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I think
sometimes.
I'm really sorry, but is it a quick question? Because did you heard the announcement? That's essentially get out of here announcement. So if it's a quick question, or if you can promise that we're going to give a quick answer, we can have that.
Oh, fair enough. I missed the presentation, sorry about that, but what sort of is curious to say that it is modeling with very much department and so forth, they sort of immediately understood them. And I'm just wondering if that's because they usually deal with this local mobility but high impact events, which are difficult to include in the models, which are more sort of typically in the somehow in the expected scenario, not sort of considering the outliers. So I was wondering that if it is possible to do backwards sort of estimation for what would be the return on investment if you sort of decided to finance risk management now instead of waiting for this unlikely but high impact event, because in the end it's a probabilistic finance function. And I'm continuously amazed why that investment decisions.
Yeah, and that probably is true. The more concrete you can get, so as long as you can discuss the very specific investments, and then I think, yeah, I think it would be viable.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. That was very succinct answer. And on that note, I would like to first of all thank our speakers. So thank you so much for coming. And I would also like to acknowledge the structures that make this possible. So one is Satu, without her, nothing would happen. And also, of course, Design Museum generously giving us the space for year after year. So thank you so much. And yeah, we need to evacuate the place.
This is a crisis.
Yes, there are people who will get very angry upstairs if we don't, but thank you so much. This was great. Yeah. Great. Super interesting project. I'm very, very intrigued.